with us on the Feast of St. Damien. My name is Maggie Gallagher. Oh, look, Roseanne wants to come. We'll let her in, let a few latecomers in. And we just feel so lucky to be with you and honored that a really fine Catholic writer and director, playwright, Ruth Palileo, decided to, as we were talking over what we could do for the Feast of St. Damien, put together this three-man show featuring readings, which are kind of three different views of the lepers of Molokai, ending with the perspective of St. Damien as seen through a contemporary playwright, well, dead now, but the play was written in the 70s, Aldith Morris. So without further ado, I just say that for those of you who do not know, most of you do, but the Benedict XVI Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Worship was founded by Archbishop Cordileone with a mission of opening the door of beauty to God through more beautiful and reverent liturgy, and by helping to energize a Catholic culture of the arts. And by your interest in being here, by your gifts, which we're really quite honored by those of you who chose or were able to give of your treasure. Also, of course, the main thing that our artists need is, if we don't pay them anything else, we need to pay attention to their gifts, because that is really what inspires them to go on. So you are part of what I, perhaps with a bit more enthusiasm than literal truth, call the ongoing Catholic Renaissance. That is the way it feels here at the Benedict XVI Institute. Archbishop Cordileone, do you want to lead us in prayer and give us a few words about a great saint?
Sure. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for our actors and organizers. Let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, on this feast day of Saint Damien of Molokai, we thank you for this great gift of this loving saint who gave his all to serve those closest and dearest to your heart. Grant us the grace to follow his example of heroic virtue and sacrificial love, giving of ourselves in charity, to be in solidarity with those who are most marginalized and most despised of society. Grant us the wisdom, the grace, and the strength to be your hands, your heart, and your feet, to bring the message of good news and of healing to a broken society. Help us to be witnesses the dignity of every human life, and bless our time together today, that what we see and hear here might touch our hearts and minds to be more like Christ, your Son, and bring us light and peace to the world. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son. Amen.
You might mute yourself if you have a barking dog, especially. Kevin, maybe you should mute all, and then let's have the speakers and mute.
So as I referenced in the prayer, today is the actual feast day of St. Damien of Molokai, a relatively recent saint added to the calendar, but those of us in the United States, especially here in the West, know that it was well merited that he be added to the church's roll of saints. We also feel a special connection to him here in San Francisco. Marin County is in our archdiocese. It's on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge, on the other side of the bay to the north of us. And there is a small town there called Olima. It's in a rural area of West Marin County where we have a parish. And that parish has the building on its grounds that used to be the house of the Sacred Heart's father, the order to which St. Damien belonged to. And the Sacred Heart's fathers had that mission to the leper colony of Molokai in Hawaii. And that when they were traveling there, they would stay in this house and to continue on to Hawaii, or on the way back to Belgium, or they would come sometimes for rest. So it was a stopping off point for them between Belgium and their travel, the long journey to Hawaii. I'm sure many of you have been to Molokai and you've seen the leper colony there. I had the great grace of visiting there about 9 years ago, 8, 9 years ago now.
Oh, jeez, I can hear a little bit.
Can you mute yourself, please? Go ahead, sorry.
This was shortly after the canonization of Saint Marianne Cope. Saint Marianne Cope.
Kevin, can you mute? I'm sorry, we're getting latecomers and they're coming
Mute
in.
everyone again, Kevin, and I'll unmute myself.
Yeah,
This was shortly after the canonization of Saint Marianne Cope. She was a Franciscan sister from New York. Her order went out there to Molokai to assist as well in the leper colony. They actually overlapped for a few years. Saint Marianne arrived in the last few years of Saint Damian's life, and Bishop Larry Silva of Honolulu, organized a pilgrimage for his brother bishops there to the leper colony of Molokai. And I was struck at the reality of what they must have faced 100, 150 years ago. Was very powerful. It is very remote. There was very much a sense of being at the end of the world, cut off from the entire rest of the world. And I was just struck so profoundly at how when Saint Damian arrived and the lepers arrived and all the other missionaries and those who cared for them arrived there, they were cut off from the rest of the world for the rest of their lives. The distress and the devastation, which is just very, very powerful to me there. So it is a holy place. I sense the holiness of the place, marked by Saint Damian, Saint Marianne, and all the others who gave such loving care to God's suffering people, those closest and dearest to his heart. They were farthest away from us, but they're closest to God. And being close to them brings us close to God. You're muted, Maggie.
I think there's also a relic of Saint Damian under the altar of your cathedral. Maybe you could tell us a little bit. That was the custom for centuries. I'm not sure it's still done, but to lay the altars of cathedrals in particular above the relics of saints and martyrs.
Yes, it goes back to ancient times, actually, that altars would have relics of saints in them, going back to when in the early centuries when the church would celebrate a mass at the tomb of a martyr or of a saint, especially of the martyrs. And the traditional requirement was that there had to be relics of at least 3 martyrs who had to be martyrs. It's not so tightly regulated now. But it still is, it's in the norm to have relics in the altar. In the old days, before Vatican II, there was a stone. It was a kind of a square, about half an inch thick, that would have a little hole in it that then was sealed over with concrete with the relics there, and then it was placed on the mensa, the top of the altar. Now the norm, it's still there that we have relics of saints, but it's supposed to be within the altar, under the top of the altar. And that's what we have in the altar at St. Mary's Cathedral here in San Francisco, which we just finished celebrating its 50th anniversary. It was the first church built to be a cathedral after Vatican II. It was dedicated in 1971. So the relics are in the altar, not in the old style of the altar stone, but they are under the mensa, the top of the altar. They're contained there, among which is, and of course, in 1971, he was not yet beatified or even canonized, let alone canonized. But as I said, we here in the West knew that he was destined to be recognized by the church for his saintly heroic virtue. So there is a piece of the casket that he was buried in Molokai within the altar there in our cathedral at St. Mary's Cathedral.
Wow. I think we'll get on with the main show here, and then there'll be a talk back afterwards. I can't promise the Archbishop can stay for the whole thing because I know how much he has on his schedule, but we're so grateful for you for coming and opening us with prayer and sharing some of your insights here. Before, I'm going to introduce our director to introduce the cast and then let the play begin. But before they do that, I want to mention my partner in crime, who you see up there, Kevin Kakvinsky, who's the director of Mission Advancement. That's his title, but I kind of just think of him as my partner in crime. or in virtue, something like that. Kevin, you want to say hello to everybody? Because if you don't know him, you'd love him. I love him.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Ruth, Palileo, a playwright. Her plays have been staged in Ireland. She runs a theater company, and she wrote a play that I have not yet read, but I keep meaning to, about a collision between Mexican folklore and Irish fairy lore, which I always thought was kind of fascinating. I'll get out of the way now, and Ruth, the show is yours. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. So I'm going to just briefly introduce the three actors this evening. Michael Finnegan will be playing Jack London. Jonathan East will be playing Robert Louis Stevenson. And James Murphy will be playing Father Damien. And at this point, I'll just say actors, places please, and invite you all to enjoy the show.
The Lepers of Molokai, Jack London. When the Snark sailed along the windward coast of Molokai on her way to Honolulu in 1908, I looked at the chart, then pointed to a low-lying peninsula backed by a tremendous cliff varying from 2,000 to 4,000 feet in height and said, "The pit of hell, the most cursed place on earth." I should have been shocked if, at that moment, I could have caught a vision of myself a month later, ashore in the most cursed place on earth and having a disgracefully good time, along with 800 of the lepers who were likewise having a good time. Their good time was not disgraceful, but mine was. For in the midst of so much misery, it was not meet for me to have a good time. That is the way I felt about it, and my only excuse is that I couldn't help having a good time. For instance, in the afternoon of the 4th of July, all the lepers gathered at the racetrack for the sports. I had wandered away from the superintendent and the physicians in order to get a snapshot of the finish of one of the races. It was an interesting race, and partisanship ran high. 3 horses were entered, one ridden by a Chinese, one by a Hawaiian, and one by a Portuguese boy. All 3 riders were lepers, so were the judges and the crowd. The race was twice around the track. The Chinese and the Hawaiian got away together and rode neck and neck, the Portuguese boy toiling along about 200 feet behind. Around they went in the same positions. Halfway around the second and final lap, the Chinese pulled away and got one length ahead of the Hawaiian. At the same time, the Portuguese boy was beginning to crawl up, but it looked hopeless. The crowd went wild. All the lepers were passionate lovers of horseflesh. The Portuguese boy crawled nearer and nearer. I went wild too. They were on the home stretch. The Portuguese boy passed the Hawaiian. There was a thunder of hooves, a rush of 3 horses bunched together, the jockeys plying their whips, and every honest onlooker bursting in his throat or hers with shouts and yells nearer and nearer, inch by inch. The Portuguese boy crept up and just passed, winning by a head from the Chinese. I came to myself in a group of lepers. They were yelling, tossing their hats and dancing around like fiends. So was I. When I came to, I was waving my hat and murmuring ecstatically, "By golly, the boy wins! The boy wins!" I tried to check myself. I assured myself that I was witnessing one of the horrors of Molokai, and that it had been shameful for me, under such circumstances, to be so lighthearted and lightheaded. But it was no use. The next event was a donkey race, and it was just starting. So was the fun. The last donkey in was to win the race. And what complicated the affair was that no rider rode his own donkey. They rode one another's donkeys, the result of which was that each man strove to make the donkey that he rode beat his own donkey, ridden by someone else. Naturally, only men possessing very slow or extremely obstreperous donkeys had entered them for this race. One donkey had been trained to tuck in its legs and lie down whenever its rider touched its sides with his heels. Some donkeys strove to turn around and come back. Others developed a penchant for the side of the track, where they stuck their heads over the railing and stopped, while all of them dawdled. Halfway around the track, one donkey got into an argument with its rider. While all the rest of the donkeys had crossed the wire, that particular donkey was still arguing. He won the race, though his rider lost it, and came in on foot. And all the while, nearly 1,000 lepers were laughing uproariously at the fun. Anybody in my place would have joined in with them in having a good time. All the foregoing is by way of preamble to the statement that the horrors of Molokai, as they have been painted in the past, do not exist. The settlement has been written up repeatedly by sensationalists, and usually by sensationalists who have never laid eyes on it. Of course, leprosy is leprosy, and it is a terrible thing. But so much that is lurid has been written about Molokai that neither the lepers nor those who devote their lives to them have received a fair deal. Here is a case in point. A newspaper writer, who of course had never been near the settlement, vividly described Superintendent McVeigh crouching in a grass hut and being besieged nightly by starving lepers on their knees, wailing for food. This hair-raising account was copied by the press all over the United States and was the cause of many indignant and protesting editorials. Well, I lived and slept for 5 days in Mr. McVeigh's grass hut, which was a comfortable wooden cottage, by the way. And there isn't a grass house on the whole settlement. I heard the lepers wailing for food, only the wailing was particularly harmonious and rhythmic, and it was accompanied by the music of stringed instruments, violins, guitars, ukuleles, and banjos. Also, the wailing was of various sorts. The leper brass band wailed, and 2 singing societies wailed. And lastly, a quintet of excellent voices wailed. So much for a lie that should never have been printed. The wailing was the serenade which the glee clubs always give Mr. McVeigh when he returns from a trip to Honolulu. Leprosy is not so contagious as is imagined. I went for a week's visit to the settlement, and I took my wife along, all of which would not have happened had we had any apprehension of contracting the disease. Nor did we wear long, gauntleted gloves and keep apart from the lepers. On the contrary, we mingled freely with them, and before we left, knew scores of them by sight and name. The precautions of simple cleanliness seem to be all that is necessary. On returning to their own houses, after having been among and handling lepers, the non-lepers, such as the physicians and the superintendent, merely wash their faces and hands with mildly antiseptic soap and change their coats. That a leper is unclean, however, should be insisted upon, and the segregation of lepers, from what little is known of the disease, should be rigidly maintained. On the other hand, the awful horror with which the leper has been regarded in the past and the frightful treatment he has received have been unnecessary and cruel. In order to dispense some of the popular misapprehensions about leprosy, I want to tell you something of the relations between the lepers and the non-lepers as I have observed them on Molokai. On the morning after our arrival, the club was just beginning a prize shoot for a cup put up by Mr. McVeigh, who is also a member of the club, as also are Dr. Goodhue and Dr. Holloman, the resident physicians, who, by the way, live in the settlement with their wives. All about us in the shooting booth were the lepers. Lepers and non-lepers were using the same guns. They were all rubbing shoulders in the same confined space. The majority of the lepers were Hawaiians. Sitting beside me on a bench was a Norwegian. Directly in front of me in the stand was an American, a veteran of the Civil War, who had fought on the Confederate side. He was 65 years of age, but that did not prevent him from running up a good score. Strapping Hawaiian policemen, lepers, khaki-clad, were also shooting, as were Portuguese, Chinese, and Kukas. The latter are native helpers in the settlement who are non-lepers. And on the afternoon that Charmian and I climbed the 2,000-foot pali and looked upon our last of the settlement, the superintendent, the doctors, and a mixture of the nationalities and of the diseased and of the non-diseased were all engaged in an exciting baseball game. Leprosy was unknown in Europe until it was introduced by the returning Crusaders, whereupon it spread slowly until it had seized upon a large number of people. Obviously, it was a disease that could be contracted by contact. It was a contagion, and it was equally obvious that it could be eradicated by segregation. Terrible and monstrous, as was the treatment of the leper in those days, and great lesson of segregation was learned. By its means, leprosy was stamped out, and by the same means, leprosy is even now decreasing in the Hawaiian Islands. But the segregation of the lepers on Molokai is not the horrible nightmare that has been so often exploited by yellow writers. In the first place, the leper is not torn ruthlessly from his family. When a suspect is discovered, he is invited by the Board of Health to come to the Kalihi receiving station at Honolulu. His fare and expenses are paid for him. He is first passed on upon microscopical examination by the bacteriologist of the Board of Health. If the Bacillus leprae is found, the patient is examined by the Board of Examining Physicians, 5 in number. If found to be a leper, he is so declared, which finding is later officially confirmed by the Board of Health, and the leper is ordered straight to Molokai. Furthermore, during the thorough trial that is given his case, the patient has the right to be represented by a physician whom he can select and employ for himself. Nor, after having been declared a leper, is this patient immediately rushed off to Molokai. He is given ample time, weeks, and even months sometimes, during which he stays at Kalihi and winds up or rearranges all of his business affairs. At Molokai, in turn, he may be visited by his relatives, business agents, etc. Though are not permitted to eat and sleep in his house, visitors' houses kept clean are maintained for this purpose. In spite of the fact that they are afflicted by disease, the lepers form a happy colony, divided into 2 villages and numerous country and seaside homes of nearly 1,000 souls. They have 6 churches, a Young Men's Christian Association building, several assembly halls, a bandstand, a racetrack, baseball grounds, shooting ranges, an athletic club, numerous glee clubs, and 2 brass bands. They are so contented down there, Mr. Pinkham told me, that you can't drive them away with a shotgun. This I later verified for myself. In January of this year, 11 of the lepers on whom the disease, after having committed certain ravages, showed no further signs of activity, were brought back to Honolulu for re-examination. They were loath to come, and on being asked whether or not they wanted to go free if found clean of leprosy, one and all answered, "Back to Molokai." As regards the fear of leprosy itself, nowhere in the settlement among lepers or non-lepers did I see any sign of it. The chief horror of leprosy obtains in the minds of those who have never seen a leper and who do not know anything about the disease. At the hotel at Waikiki, a lady expressed shuddering amazement at my having the hardihood to pay a visit to the settlement. On talking with her, I learned that she had been born in Honolulu, had lived there all of her life, and had never laid eyes on a leper. That was more than I could say of myself in the United States, where the segregation of lepers is loosely enforced, and where I have repeatedly seen lepers on the streets of large cities. Leprosy is terrible. There is no getting away from that. But from what little I know of the disease and its degree of contagiousness, I would by far prefer to spend the rest of my days in Molokai than in any tuberculosis sanatorium. In every city and country hospital for poor in the United States or in similar institutions in other countries, sights as terrible as those in Molokai can be witnessed. And the sum total of these sights is vastly more terrible. For that matter, if it were given me to choose between being compelled to live in Molokai for the rest of my life, or in the East End of London, the East Side of New York, or the stockyards of Chicago, I would select Molokai without debate. I would prefer 1 year of life in Molokai to 5 years of life in the above-mentioned cesspools of human degradation and misery. In Molokai, the people are happy. I shall never forget the celebration of the 4th of July I witnessed there. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the horribles were out, dressed fantastically, astride horses, mules, and donkeys, their own property, and cutting capers all over the settlement. 2 brass bands were out as well. Then there were the Pau riders, 30 or 40 of them. Hawaiian women, all superb horsewomen, dressed gorgeously in the old native riding costume and dashing about in 2s and 3s in groups. In the afternoon, Charmian and I stood in the judges' stand and awarded the prizes for horsemanship and costume to the Pau riders. All about were the hundreds of lepers with wreaths of flowers on heads and necks and shoulders, looking on and making merry. And always over the brows of hills and across the grassy level stretches, appearing and disappearing, were the groups of men and women gaily dressed on galloping horses, horses and riders flower bedecked and flower garlanded, singing and laughing and riding like the wind. As I stood in the judges' stand and looked at all of this, there came to my recollection the Lazar house in Havana, where I had once beheld some 200 lepers, prisoners, inside 4 restricted walls until they died. No, there are a few thousand places I wot of in this world over which I would select Molokai as a place of permanent residence. In the evening, we went to one of the leper assembly halls, where before a crowded audience, the singing societies contested for prizes, and where the night wound up with a dance. I have seen the Hawaiians living in the slums of Honolulu, and having seen them, I can readily understand why the lepers brought up from the settlement for re-examination shouted, one and all, "Back to Molokai!" Leprosy is as old as history. References to it are found in the earliest written records. And yet today, practically nothing more is known about it than was known then. This much was known then, namely, that it was contagious and that those afflicted should be segregated. The difference between then and now is that today the leper is more rigidly segregated and more humanely treated. But leprosy itself still remains the same awful and profound mystery. One possible generalization that can be drawn from all of the investigation that has been made is that leprosy is feebly contagious. But in what manner it is feebly contagious is not known. They have isolated the bacillus of leprosy. They can determine by bacteriological examination whether or not a person is a leper, but they are as far away as ever from knowing how that bacillus finds its entrance into the body of a non-leper. They do not know the length of time of incubation. They have tried to inoculate all sorts of animals with leprosy and have failed. Leprosy is feebly contagious, but how is it contagious? An Austrian physician has inoculated himself and his assistants with leprosy and failed to catch it. But this is not conclusive, for there is the famous case of the Hawaiian murderer who had his sentence of death commuted to life imprisonment on his agreeing to be inoculated with the Bacillus leprae. Sometime after inoculation, leprosy made its appearance, and the man died a leper on Molokai. Nor was this conclusive, for it was discovered that at the time he was inoculated, several members of his family were already suffering from the disease on Molokai. He may have contracted the disease from them, and it may have been well along in its mysterious period of incubation at the time he was officially inoculated. Then there is the case of that hero of the church, Father Damien, who went to Molokai a clean man and died a leper. There have been many theories as to how he contracted leprosy, but nobody knows. He never knew himself.
An open letter to the Reverend Dr. Hyde of Honolulu from Robert Louis Stevenson. Sydney, February 25th, 1890. Sir, it may probably occur to you that we have met and visited and conversed on my side with interest. You may remember that you have done me several courtesies for which I was prepared to be grateful. But there are duties which come before gratitude, and offences which justly divide friends, far more acquaintances. Your letter to the Reverend H.B. Gage is a document which in my sight, if you filled me with bread when I was starving, if you had sat up to nurse my father when he lay dying, would yet absolve me from the bonds of gratitude. If I have at all learned the trade of using words to convey the truth and arouse emotion, you have at last furnished me with a subject. For it is in the interest of all mankind and the cause of public decency in every quarter of the world, not only that Damien should be righted, but that you and your letter should be displayed at length in their true colours in the public eye. To do this properly, I must begin by quoting you at large. I shall then proceed to criticize your utterance from several points of view, divine and human, in the course of which I shall attempt to draw again, and with more specification, the character of the dead saint whom it has pleased you to vilify. So much being done, I shall say farewell to you forever. To deal fitly with a letter so extraordinary, I must draw at the outset on my private knowledge of the signatory and his sect. It may offend others, scarcely you, who have been so busy to collect, so bold to publish gossip on your rivals. And this perhaps the moment when I may best explain to you the character of what you are to read. I conceive you as a man quite beyond and below the reticences of civility. With what measure you met, with that shall it be measured you again. With you at last, I rejoice to feel the button off the foil and plunge it home. You, sir, belong to a sect, I believe my sect, and that in which my ancestors laboured, which has enjoyed and partly failed to utilize an exceptional advantage in the islands of Hawaii. The first missionaries came, they found the land already self-purged of its old and bloody faith. They were embraced, almost on arrival, with enthusiasm. What troubles they supported came far more from whites than Hawaiians. And to these last they stood in a rough figure in the shoes of God. This is not the place to enter into the degree or causes of their failure, such as it is. One element alone is pertinent and must be plainly dealt with. In the course of their evangelical calling, they, or too many of them, grew rich. It may be news to you that the houses of the missionaries are a cause of mocking on the streets of Honolulu. It will at least be news to you that when I returned your civil visit, the driver of my cab commented on the size, the taste, and the comfort of your home. I think I see you, for I try to see you in the flesh as I write these sentences. I think I see you leap at the word pigsty, a hyperbolical expression at the best. He had no hand in the reforms. He was a coarse, dirty man. These are your own words. And I think it is possible that I am come to support you with fresh evidence. In a sense, it is even so. Damien has been too much depicted with a conventional halo and conventional features. So drawn by men who perhaps had not the eye to remark or the pen to express the individual, or who perhaps were only blinded and silenced by generous admiration for the truth that is suppressed by friends, is the readiest weapon of the enemy. The world in your despite may perhaps owe you something. If your letter be the means of substituting once and for all a credible likeness for a wax abstraction, for if that world at all remembers you on the day when Damien of Molokai shall be named a saint, it will be in virtue of one work, your letter. You may ask on what authority I speak. It was my inclement destiny to become acquainted, not with Damien, but with Dr. Hyde. When I visited the Lazaretto, Damien was already resting in his grave. But such information as I have, I gathered on the spot in conversation with those who knew him well and long. Some indeed who revered his memory, but others who had sparred and wrangled with him, who had beheld him with no halo, who perhaps regarded him with small respect, and through whose unprepared and scarcely partial communications the plain human features of the man shone on me convincingly. These gave me what knowledge I possess. And I learnt it in that scene where it could be most completely and sensitively understood. Kalaweo, which you have never visited, and about which you have never so much as endeavoured to inform yourself. I imagine you to be one of those persons who talk with cheerfulness of that place with oxen and wain ropes, who could not drag you to behold. You who do not even know its situation on the map, probably denounce sensational descriptions, stretching your limbs while in your pleasant parlour at Beretania Street. I do not think I am a man more usually timid, but I never recall the days and nights I spent upon that island promontory, 8 days and 7 nights, without heartful thankfulness that I am somewhere else. I find in my diary that I speak of my stay with grinding experience. And observe that which I saw and suffered from was a settlement purged, bettered, beautified. The new village built, the hospital and the bishop home excellently arranged, the sisters, the doctor and the missionaries all indefatigable in their noble tasks. It was a different place when Damien came there and made this great renunciation and slept that first night under the tree amidst his rotting brethren, alone with pestilence and looking forward. With what courage, with what pitiful sinkings of dread, God only knows, to a lifetime of dressing sores and stumps. There is something wrong here, either with you or me. It is possible, for instance, that you, who seem to have so many ears in Kalaweo, had heard of the affair of Mr. Chapman's money, and were singly struck by Damien's intended wrongdoing. I was struck with that also, and sitting fairly doon. I was struck much more by the fact that he had the honesty of mind to be convinced. I may here tell you that it was a long business, and that his colleagues sat with him late into the night. multiplying arguments and accusations, that the father listened, as usual, with perfect good nature and perfect obstinacy. But at the last, when he was persuaded,
Yes,
he said,
I am very much obliged to you. You have done me a service. It would have been a theft.
there are many, not Catholics merely, who require their true heroes and saints to be infallible. To these, the story will be painful, not to the true lovers, patrons, and servants of mankind. And I take it this is the type of our division, that you are one of those who have an eye for faults and failures, that you take a pleasure to find and publish them, and that having found them, you make haste to forget the overvailing virtues and real success which had alone introduced them to your knowledge. It is a dangerous frame of mind, that you may understand how dangerous and into what situation it has already brought you. We will, if you please, go hand in hand through the different phrases of your letter, and candidly examine each from the point of view of its truth, its oppositeness, and its charity. Damien was coarse. It's very possible. You make us sorry for the lepers, who had only a coarse old peasant for a friend and father. But you, who are so refined, why were you not there to cheer them with the lights of culture? Or may I remind you that we have some reason to doubt if John the Baptist was genteel? And in the case of Peter, on whose career you doubtless dwell approvingly in the pulpit, no doubt at all he was a coarse, headstrong fisherman. Yet even in our Protestant Bibles, Peter is called a saint. Damien was dirty. He was. Think of the poor lepers, annoyed with this dirty comrade. But the clean Dr. Hyde was at his food in his fine house. Damien was headstrong. I believe you're right again, and I thank God for his strong head and heart. Damien was bigoted. I'm not fond of bigots myself, because they're not fond of me. But what is meant by bigotry? That we should regard it as a blemish in a priest. Damien believed his own religion with the simplicity of a peasant or a child. But the point of interest in Damien, which has caused him to be so much talked about and made him at last the subject of your pen and mine, was that in him, his bigotry, his intense and narrow faith, wrought potential for good and strengthened him to be one of the world's heroes and exemplars. Damien was not sent to Molokai, but went there without orders. Is this a misreading? Or do you really mean the words for blame? I have heard Christ in the pulpits of our church held up for imitation on the grounds his sacrifice was voluntary. Does Dr. Hyde think otherwise? Damien did not stay at the settlement, etc. It is true, he was allowed many indulgences. Am I to understand that you blame the father for profiting by these, or the officers for granting them? In either case, it is mighty Spartan standard to issue from the house on Britannia Street, and I am convinced you will find yourself with few supporters. Damien had no hand in the reforms, etc. I think even you will admit that I have already been frank in my description of the man I am defending. And I tell you that to a mind not prejudiced by jealousy, all the reforms of the Lazaretto, and even those which he most vigorously opposed, and properly the work of Damien, they are the evidence of his success. They are what heroism provoked the reluctant and careless. Many were before him in the field. Before his day, even you will confess, they had effected little. It was his part, by one striking act of martyrdom, to direct all men's eyes on the distressful country. At a blow, with the price of his life, he made the place illustrious and public. And that, if you will consider largely, was one of the reform needful, was the one reform needful, pregnant of all that should succeed. It brought money, it brought the sisters, it brought supervision, for public opinion and public interest landed with the man at Calaweo. If ever any man brought reforms and died to bring them, it was he. This is not a clean cup. There is not a clean cup or a towel in the bishop home, but dirty Damien washed it. Damien was not a pure man in his relations with women. How do you know that? Is this the nature of conversation in that house on Beretania Street, which the cabman envied driving past? Racy details of misconduct of the poor peasant, toiling on the cliffs of Molokai. Many have visited the station before me. They seem not to have heard the rumour when I was there. I heard many shocking tales, for my informants were men speaking with the plainness of the laity. And I heard plenty of complaints of Damien. Why was this never mentioned? And how came it to you in your retirement of your clerical parlour? But I must not even seem to deceive you. This scandal, when I read it in your letter, was not new to me. I had heard it once before, and I must tell you how. There came a man to Samoa from Honolulu. He, in a public house on the beach, volunteered the statement that Damien had contracted the disease from having connections with female lepers. And I find a joy in telling you how the report was welcomed in the public house. A man sprang to his feet. I'm not at liberty to give his name, but from what I heard, I doubt if you would care to have him at dinner in Beretania Street. You miserable little... Here is a word I dare not print. It would so shock your ears. You miserable little... He cried. If the story were 1,000 times true, can't you see you are 1,000,000 times a lower for daring to repeat it? Is it growing at all clear to you what a picture you have drawn of your own heart? I will try yet once again to make it clearer. You had a father, and suppose this tale were about him, and some informant brought it to you, proof in hand. I am not making too high an estimate of your emotional nature when I suppose you would regret the circumstance. Well, the man who tried to do what Damien did is my father. and the father of the man at the bar, and the father of the man who loves goodness. And he was your father too, if God had given you the grace to see it.
The day I died, Monday of Holy Week, 1889, Palm Sunday night around 11:45, Brother James lights the lantern, wakes up Father Conradi, the priest who's come to take my place here at the leper settlement. And together they go to the church next door. Soon I hear them coming back. Brother James ringing the little altar bell as he walks ahead of Father Conradi in the dark. Up they come to my room. Brother James holds the napkin under my chin. Father Conradi says in a sleepy voice, "The body and blood of Christ." And I receive my last communion. Then Father Conradi asks if he can have my cassock, threadbare and full of leprosy. What would he do with it? Better I be buried in it. Next thing I know, my roosters are crowing, and it's getting light. It's hard to breathe. So Brother James helps me to sit up. And while he's holding me, I breathe for the last time. As Brother James bends over to close my eyes, the farewell chant begins outside my door and spreads throughout the settlement till every leper knows that Camiano's spirit has departed. Brother James brings the basin, washes my body and dresses it in my old cassock, and carries it into the church. He puts it in a plain redwood box, and the rest of the day I lie in state. The choir sings my favorite hymns. The lepers file in to say goodbye. This time I have no ointment for their sores, no little jokes to raise their spirits. By afternoon, my sores have crusted over with black scabs. The sickness has consumed me. It has nothing left to feed upon. Toward evening, Father Conradi helps Brother James dress me in my vestments. They light the candles and tiptoe out. I am alone. Everything is quiet except the pounding of the surf and the everlasting whine of Mr. Clifford's barrel organ. That kind man brought it all the way from London, hoping it would amuse us. It has, beyond all expectations. The children wind it up and let it go and are eternally surprised when it makes music of itself. After a while, it stops. And there is nothing but the surf. The Requiem Mass next day, with Father Conradi at the altar, is much the same as those I've celebrated for other lepers. Almost 3,000 of them, comforting the mourners, interceding for the dead, the choir pleading eternal rest give unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May they rest in peace. At last 8 lepers lift the coffin to their shoulders, and blind Pitero's fife and drum corps lead the procession to the cemetery. You know, sorrow at a leper's passing is tempered with gratitude for his release. So Pitero's music is anything but sad, actually more like picnic music. As we move to the new grave under the hala tree, where I spent my first night at the settlement. Young boys from the orphanage stand 4 deep around the open grave. One suddenly breaks ranks, climbs into the tree. Then the first shovelful of dirt. For 16 years, I've been sole keeper of this city of the dead. The cemetery, the church, and the rectory form one enclosure. And it has been my habit to come here after dark to say my beads. Now, I have come to rest. And so I do. For almost half a century. Then one February day, the black marble stone is rolled away, the ground dug up, the coffin lifted to the surface. A stranger's hands tear away the rotted lid. Lepers I have never known break spontaneously into Hawaiian chants and funeral songs for their dead heroes. And someone cries, "The body is intact, praise God." So it is. My hair has grown a little, and my beard. My skin's a deeper bronze, perhaps. The silver rosary is tarnished. The vestments are mouldy, and the gold embroidery dull. But there are no signs of leprosy, except for my poor feet, which are missing a toe or two. The body is intact. When I first arrived, I wrote my parents from Kohala. Here I am on an island of volcanoes, one of which, so the Hawaiians believe, is the home of Pele, goddess of eternal fire. They worship her, and whenever there's an eruption, rush to propitiate her. One man just came by on his way to offer sacrifice, so I seized the opportunity to give him a sermon on the fires of hell. He listened politely, as though he knew more about the fires of hell than I did. There are times when I am tongue-tied before them. I could know all the theology books by heart and still not know what to say. But they like me, call me Kamiano, their way of saying Damien. I keep my body in good shape and servitude by spading the vegetables and caring for the lambs, which you will be interested to know, Father, I bought for only 2.5 francs apiece. At last, I have enough chapels and animals and fields. So this year, I can spend more time studying and visiting the sick. I didn't mention the yellow flags, but they were there on trees and fence posts, even on my chapel door.
All lepers and leper suspects are hereby ordered to report to government health authorities within 14 days on pain of arrest.
Occasionally, I'd see the sheriff's men with guns and dogs, sniffing about the caves and valleys of my parish. Sometimes I'd hear a distant shot. One day, I came home to find a husband barricaded in my quarters, ready to shoot whoever tried to take his sick wife from him. One night in the confessional, a young boy coughed, hemorrhaged, and covered me with blood. Later in Honolulu, I saw that boy in one of those processions of lepers, down king to bishop, down bishop to the waterfront. I saw him torn from his parents' arms and forced into the little boat. I can still hear the father's sobs. See him crouching on the pier, straining for a last glimpse of the little boy he will never see again. I can still hear his mother's farewell chant. All this against an evening sky that seems to mock us with its beauty. What could I do to comfort them but promise that one day I would go to Malachi and see their son? In all good faith, they made those yellow flags and nailed them up throughout the kingdom on trees and posts and sides of buildings and even on my chapel doors of my Kohala mission. In all good faith, I'm sure, they bought that sour tongue of land I first saw from the ship, that natural prison surrounded on three sides by vicious surf, and on the fourth, by sheer black cliffs that stopped prevailing winds and made them dump their rain, that shut out the sun at noon, so the land lay half a day in shadow. The place without a sunset, the lepers call it. In all good faith, that government body rounded up the lepers at gunpoint when necessary and shipped them off with a pair of pants or a cotton dress and a promise of daily rations to supplement what they hoped the lepers themselves would produce. In all good faith, they called an empty wooden building a hospital and promised to staff it and stock it with supplies. Effective? Yes. It got the lepers out of circulation so the foreign population could relax. Humane? No. It was a barbarous method of isolation. That tongue of land became a living graveyard. Can you imagine hundreds, sometimes as many as thousands, of lepers crowded 6, 8, 10 into stinking one-room windowless shacks? Can you imagine a community of the living dead without a doctor or a nurse? No resident police, no law, no work, no comfort, and no hope. As for the hospital, an empty building where the sickest ones lay on the bare floor in their own filth and waited. But no one came, except the flies by day and the rats by night, to feast upon their sores. Some of the more able-bodied lepers, determined to wrest the last bit of pleasure from their lives, gathered in a separate place, dubbed the village of the fools, brewed liquor from roots of plants, and spent their days and nights drinking, gambling, whoring, and boasting. Aole kanawe make wahi. In this place there is no law. And raiding the rest of the settlement, stealing little girls and boys to use as slavies or to satisfy their lust. Look at them. Not one or two or three, but hundreds. In varying stages of corruption, as if the grave has given up its dead. Walking, limping, crawling, they even come in wheelbarrows. Maimed and twisted bodies, sunken faces, missing limbs, maggot-bloated sores. How, dear God, can such things be? I cannot bear to look at them. And yet, I cannot tear my eyes away as they reach out their rotting arms to welcome new lepers to this place of horror. And they are singing. Singing. Leprosy and I are face to face at last. The Catholic lepers are gathered around the bishop, begging him to send a priest, not 4 on a rotating basis, as His Excellency proposes, but 1 to live among them, to call them by their names, to be a father to them. And he is telling them he cannot sacrifice anyone. And still they beg. They are right, Your Excellency. They must have 1 priest who belongs to them to prove to them that God has not forgotten them. I suffer if I go a week without confession. They must go months, years without confession. And the Mass. They must face death without the sacraments. You don't have to ask, Your Excellency. I want to be their priest. I beg to stay. You have your priest. Do you hear? I am to be your priest. My name is Camiano. Confessions this afternoon, all night if necessary. And Easter Mass at sunrise. Next morning, while it is still dark, the little church starts filling up with, God forgive me, creatures from a nightmare, limping, shuffling, coughing, spitting, touching with the fingers they have left the rosaries hung around their necks. They keep on coming till the church is filled up to the railing. They crowd the windowsills, the doorways, and they fill the church to overflowing. Not only with their corrupting bodies, not only with the stench, but with a sadness so unbearable I stand there dumb. The vomit rises in my throat. I choke it back. They kneel and wait. And finally, in a voice I have never heard before, I say the words, in nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. I remember someone showing me the shack where Hua, the kahuna, lived. While we were there, she came outside and pointed to a formation in the clouds like a calabash mouth downward, and said that it meant the king would die and Emma would be queen, and she would let all the lepers go home. And I remember a young woman in a dirty bathrobe sort of garment, telling me she's cold, then opening up her bathrobe to show me she has nothing underneath. And then there's the man who comes from one of the shacks, carrying a large bundle of dirty rags. He puts the bundle in the wheelbarrow, pushes it to the empty jailhouse, and shakes it till the dirty rags roll out. I see the bundle move. I hear it groan. I watch it pull itself into the doorway and lie down, face down to die. Later, 2 lepers come, roll the bundle over, tie it to a pole, hands and feet like a luau pig, and take it to the cemetery and bury it in a shallow grave. And I remember my first night under the tree there in the cemetery, with rats and scorpions and centipedes to share my vigil, and the sound of wild pigs at that shallow grave eating their fill. It was 3 whole days before I could look at some of the lepers without revulsion. Weeks before I could endure the graveyard smell. A visiting doctor of the Board of Health would always put a piece of camphor in a handkerchief and tie it around his neck. And every now and then he'd spray himself with camphor liquid. I chose a pipe and strong black coffee. Yes, Your Excellency, I do leave my door open and the light burning all night, because a priest can do no less. Yes, I leave it open to women as well. They get sick and frightened too. Whoever comes, comes as Christ. What do I care what gossips say? Yes, I rub ointment on their sores with my bare hands. What would Your Excellency have me do? Attend only to the men and boys? Leave the medicine on the gatepost as visiting doctors do? Talk to my lepers through closed windows? Exhort them from the pulpit, but never chat with them in private? I'm not an agent of the Board of Health, Your Excellency. I am their priest. Yes, I did promise to be prudent. And in my own way, I am prudent. Since I am to comfort Christ in them, I am prudent never to let even a shadow of fear or disgust come between us, never to let there be anything but love. Your Excellency, I don't quarrel with other people's ideas of prudence. Let no one quarrel with mine. Yes, I do share my pipe with them. When we're together of an evening and I light my pipe, and one of them wants a puff or two, can I refuse? Can I, Your Excellency? Yes, I've thought of that. If it is God's will, I am prepared.
Wow. Thank you. Thank all of you. Perhaps the actors can all unmute themselves and we can have a little chat first and then open it up to comments or questions from the audience. Let's see. Maybe I'll start with you. Thank you. Ruth,
Yes.
Tell me how do you think about now? This is I think it kind of works as a play, although obviously it's just the readings from three different perspectives. Tell me how you began to think of this as as something that works as a play, and what did you intend?
So what happened, Maggie, is of course when you reached out to me about this particular feast day, we were interested in the piece called Damien that James performed there at the end, and it's a full-length piece, and we're still interested in it, but it's a piece that hasn't been performed in a while, so we were trying to find the rights. And as I was digging into the piece and also doing some dramaturgy for it, other writings about Saint Damien came to light, including I love both Jack London and Robert Louis Stevenson, and the pieces of writing began speaking to each other. And you'll see that. And as we began to sort of work with them, I did the first edit and then began to have discussions with the actors. And what we were fascinated about is how these pieces, because they were each moving further away from the saint, the truth of the saint. And actually, of course, the piece that was written, the latest was the play about the saint, but it was written from his perspective. So if we place that time as like time zero of his life in the leper colony, and then looked at time plus 10 years, and that was Robert Louis Stevenson, and then 40 years from on there, the narrative kept changing. And of course, I mean, I'd love the actors to pick up on this because we had such great discussions about this, but the idea of how do we get to the real saint, and also, with each character, why they were speaking for or speaking about the saint, and how stories get changed, and also this idea of closeness, just closeness to the story, closeness to the people involved in the story, just became very fascinating for us. And seeing the whole performance, because I should just say our two Irish actors it's very, very late where they are right now. It's Wednesday morning, I believe, at 2 a.m. And we were rehearsing at all sorts of crazy different times, and this is the first in quite a long time that I've seen all three pieces together myself. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And
Oh, no. So the actors again, Jack London is Michael Finnegan, and Jonathan East has played Robert Louis Stevenson, and James Murphy, that really extraordinary portrayal of Father Damien. Do either of you have a reaction? You want to talk about how this came together, how you thought about what you're doing here tonight? Somebody jump in here.
Well, I find whenever I get a message from Ruth, it's usually in a time of need, and I know there's some sort of miracle coming to me, because there's always some connection with a part that I or my family have some connection to. We played the Malcolm and Teresa play a few months ago. And I remember telling Ruth when she first told me about the play that we had a letter from Mother Teresa framed in our house, that it was something we always had a strong connection to her here in the family. And when Ruth said about Father Damien, I said, "You're not going to believe this, but again, there's a connection." So this time, my brother is actually named Damian after Father Damien of Molokai, and it came about through this man who used to go from house to house in our local area asking for help. And at the time, my mother was pregnant, and she opened the door and he asked, "If you have a boy, would you mind naming him Damien after Father Damien?" And it seemed just something so natural to my mum when the time came. And even a few years later, she was in Lourdes with the rest of my family, and a priest gave her this book on Father Damien. And it was just something so natural to to happen, and then for Ruth to come along with this play, it was something that was a real joy to be a part of. And as I said, she tends to bring miracles into people's lives.
Thank you, James. James Murphy. Jonathan East.
Hey, how you doing? It's 3 a.m. here. Hello, America. I have to be teaching for Julius Caesar in about I don't know 6 hours. My job actually is I'm a fight director and a stunt performer. And you might see me on the most heathen of shows, Vikings, which have done like over 100 episodes. So it's complete. And in that particular show, there's a constant. Michael Hurst always writes the battle between paganism and Christianity, you know, and even the new show, which is the sequel series, deals very much with the death of paganism and the expansion of Christianity across Europe. So, you know, it's the whole kind of Christianity thing is never far away. It's an interesting thing between myself and Ruth because, shockingly to everybody here, I'm agnostic. I'm actually closer to being an atheist. However, because of my upbringing here, I have massive respect for those who join the church, who stay with the church, like Ruth. It doesn't matter what flavor of Christianity. I always find myself connected to, you know, people who you know, just put themselves so into their belief. One of my best friends, I lived in Toronto for a couple of years, and one of my best friends that I made over there is Reverend Jeffrey Sanguine from the Anglican Church, and I've done performances for him in Toronto. So you know, it's a strange where, you know, personally, I'm not part of any church, but I'll help out anybody, and we have these wonderful discussions. One of which, when myself and Ruth first met, was it through Stephen Lynch? Yeah. So a guy I was doing stage combat with about 15 years ago, was it 14 years ago or something? Said they were looking for some people to kind of help Ruth fill out a play that she was doing in Werburgh Cathedral in Dublin, and she was doing the Passion of Christ over an Easter weekend. And so I went along. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I went along. You know, I was interested in just helping out, being part of a play. And we had a discussion, we had the very same discussion about, you know, faith and agnosticism and atheism and stuff like that. And it was a wonderful discussion. And Ruth went, you know what? You're my doubting Thomas. You're my doubting Thomas. And because it just, you know, it just fit. So that was the first time I worked with Ruth. And so every now and again, I just get these texts or emails and going, there's a show, John, there's like this thing. You know, I want you to do it for me. So, and that's this. You could call. I don't know whether you guys would call it a miracle or not, but I was supposed to be working on Valhalla, but I had an argument with a horse about 4 weeks ago, so I can currently not perform as a stunt performer. So I'm available for Ruth. So and to do this, and actually, you know what, being an angry Scottish writer in Samoa or Sydney has been quite a lot of fun, to be honest.
Well, it was very fun to watch you. I don't know, you guys take a look at the chat before you go, because everyone is just full of applause, calling it stunning, really appreciative. And I want to open it up for at least a little bit of audience reaction, but first I need Michael Finnegan to just say a couple of minutes, if you want, 30 seconds. How did you get involved, and what's your relationship with this?
30 seconds, huh? Clearly Maggie's never met me before. Ruthie and I go way back. We met in undergrad in 19 or something like that. And we've been amazing friends for many years now. And there really isn't too much I wouldn't do for her. And when she approached me about this project, we sort of dug into it a little bit, because she had given me a wider excerpt of Jack London's writings, and requested that I sort of give it a once over and pull out things that I thought were particularly captivating as far as telling the story of the settlement at Molokai. And the thing that struck me was, obviously London is the figure in this that is furthest removed from Father Damien himself. He basically gets to sort of see the legacy of what Father Damien created on this colony and talk about that. But his personal relationship is tangential at best. But the thing that I thought was really striking was, this is a writer who was at his sort of zenith of his popularity and his success in the very early 20th century. So we're talking like 100 years ago at this point. And the comments that he's making about how, you know, a situation that should really spark nothing but compassion and an outpouring of love and sentiment is manipulated by, you know, a sort of jaded and craven media apparatus, even at that time, to do nothing but sell newspapers and you know, move profit along for people who make money on, you know, sensationaling that which should not be sensationalized. And he's deeply offended at the way that the settlers on Molokai are being exploited yet again. And you know, that, you know, sort of not very thinly veiled contempt he has for those who, you know, say, well, I'm going to tell you how it is, having never been there, having never experienced it, and having never, you know, really put themselves out there and put any real skin in the game as far as being in the experience.
Go ahead, sorry.
My relationship with faith is a very sort of complex and ongoing process. But what it's informed by most at this point in my existence is the fact that I'm married to the daughter of a Methodist minister. And so there are a lot of conversations about what the role and what where the place of faith is in you know, history and in current day. And the one thing that we always seem to come back to is that, you know, faith that is demonstrated through acts and through works is that faith that resonates universally with everyone, whether they, you know, are the most ardent believers or, you know, don't, you know, or have question or doubt or whatever else. Those things that sort of build community are when people recognize that there's, you know, a moral compulsion or obligation to do right by a group of people, and then that is followed up by, you know, people acting on it and taking that next step and saying, no, it's not enough to just understand that this is the correct thing to do morally, but, you know, it has to be demonstrated by going out there and adding the acts with the belief in the faith itself. And that's the thing that I've always been probably the most impressed with Ruth about, is that, you know, this is a woman who so vehemently walks the talk of her faith basically every day and every hour. And, you know, I do not hold to faith as tightly as she does. I still have many questions that I'm working through in my own life and my own existence, but I find her her devotion to be inspiring and to be thought-provoking, to force me to continue to re-examine my own positions and say, you know, what do you really know, and what do you still need to figure out? And so the fact that I had an opportunity to participate in this with her and with these other very, very talented gentlemen was, yes, Jonathan, you too. And I had a ball. And I want to take one quick moment to point out the delightful irony of an Irishman who goes out and plays, a character in a series that talks about basically coming over to his homeland and kicking the crap out of his ancestors over and over and over again.
But it is, I'm a Gallagher, so that is kind of the Irish story after all, isn't it? I get knocked down and I get up again. But no, I wanted to say that I think you said something very profound, Michael, that there is a way in which turning people into objects of pity, this is what I think is somewhat very modern about Jack London's take, is another way of dehumanizing them, right? Of distancing them, of othering them. And the striking thrust of Jack London is to bring out the common humanity, not in our shared sorrows, but in our shared capacity for joy. And I thought that was really beautiful. Whether or not he could have said that to the leper colony that Father Damien went to, I somewhat doubt it. But in any case, it was really enlightening. Is there anyone, if you would like to turn on your, because you know what, actors like to see their audience. So if you would like to make a comment, could you turn on your video and raise your hand? Is that Thomas? Are you raising your hand? Ask to unmute. You have to unmute if you're going to talk.
Well, hello, everybody. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm here in Honolulu, Hawaii. So we are celebrating the feast day of St. Damien in about, I think, 2 hours time or 1 hour time. I'll be heading to the Cathedral of Our Lady of Peace, where we're going to pray with the bishop. And thank you for, promoting St. Damien. We love St. Damien. We love the Marian Pope. And we might have another saint, which is Dutton, coming up, we're very blessed in Hawaii. And, St. Damien is a symbol of peace for humanity. And I thoroughly enjoyed this play. I'm not so much a theater person, but when I got this email today, and I said, I would love to, support what Archbishop Corleone is doing. And well done to everybody. And we're very proud of you from Hawaii, of what you are doing. Thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you. All right, I'm looking around. I see the back end. You all got your videos off. So anyone else want to raise their hand and say a word before we let these poor Irishmen get to bed?
I'd like to say a word if I can. Tony Rouse. When I was young, I had the calling to want to serve those in need. And so I ended up, after graduating from college, being a volunteer and working for the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. There was a St. Vincent de Paul National Western Region meeting in Hawaii that I went to, and I took a tour over to Molokai because I had read a book about Father Damien, and he was such a huge inspiration to me. And when I saw went through the colony and so forth, somewhere back when I was 28, or this is like 40 years ago, when I was 28 or between 28 and 30, I made a promise to God that if I ever got married, I would name, and I had a son, I would name him after Father Damien. Well, sure enough, when I was 47, me and my wife were having our second child, my son, and I told her I wanted to name him Damian Francis, and Francis being for my father, for St. Francis, and for St. Francis Church, East Palo Alto, where I did a lot of good because of my calling to faith. And my wife agreed only partially, and she said, you can call him Francis Damien, because she said she didn't want kids making fun of her son by calling him the devil at school or whatever. But I recently last year retired at 70 from the St. Vincent de Paul in various capacities, from executive director to chief financial officer, and to this day I'm still a very active St. Vincent de Paul volunteer, serving my neighbors in need. So I just wanted to share that story.
Tony, thank you so much. We get one more quick comment from, that doesn't look like an Annabella Sakona, but come in.
Yeah, my daughter, sorry, name. Yes, first of all, if Cordileone, Archbishop Cordileone watching, he interviewed myself and my wife for the diaconate when he was in Oakland Diocese, and we told him from Tonga, and he was quite surprised. But anyway, last December, we went to Molokai on a pilgrimage to St. Damiano, and from there we brought a stone from one of the churches that he built. And last week we were in Belgium at the his crypt.
His
and
resting place.
His resting place, and we talked to the parish priest. And the pilgrimage with a lot of Polynesian, a lot of Tongan that follow us. The priests allow us to present the stone from Molokai at the crypt of, it's like a lava rock, at the resting place of Father Damien, and thank him for his work and his ministry to the lepers of Molokai. And it was such a moving experience. And when I was in Hawaii, a composer, wrote a song for Damiano, and we played that song there at the crypt in Louvain, at the Catholic University of Louvain. And I want to thank Cordileone when he interviewed me and my wife. Then he went to San Francisco as our bishop. We went on, we were ordained deacon, and part of our ministry is to, is to go and bring the life of the saints alive, especially at this time of cancel culture.
21 mission.
And and that's all I want to say at the moment.
Is your song up on YouTube? Could you send me a link?
I definitely will.
Okay, you just hit reply to the email. It goes straight to me. I'd love to hear it and maybe share it. So thank you for that. Also, I just want to say, if you've never heard a Tongan choir, it's a really beautiful liturgical chant. And we do have one in the Bay Area. I think it's in Menlo Park. But it's an example of an adaptation of the classic chant fused with native rhythms, but in a way that elevates it to the sacred. And it's just really quite striking and beautiful. You can Google it, or maybe I'll find a link and share that too. Well, I just want to, yep.
I just want to thank the actors. They were excellent. Thank you for the performance.
Thank you. I want to respect the time zone differences here, and maybe we'll wrap up. I know I could have fun chatting with each and every one of you. Thank you so much for being here. Kevin, do you remember what our next event is? I'm blanking here. We have, well, on the feast of, there's not a feast, on relevant, because he's not a saint yet, but our next American saint we're focusing on is Father Augustus Tolton, who is the first Black American to become a priest. And he had to fight very hard, and he had to go to Rome because he couldn't find any seminary that would admit him in this country. And the creators of a one-man play about Father Tolton, or I don't even know if it's a one-man play. The creators of a play about Father Tolton that is traveling the country are going to come on and talk about the man and also the creative process. So we're in play mode, and that is, I believe, June 12th. But open up. If you're not getting the Benedict 16 newsletter every week, it's going to your spam folder. So take a look for it. For some reason, we're getting more people, more going into spam. I don't know why, but all right. Well, thank you again. Our fine actors, Ruth, thank you so much for partnering with the Benedict 16 and sharing your gifts. Can't wait to see what God has in store next for you and me and us. And I wish you all a very happy feast of Saint Damian of Molokai. I'm not very good at public prayer. So is there anyone here? Maybe Kevin, do you want to take us out with a brief prayer?
Sorry, I was waiting for the kids to stop screaming in the background. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, we thank you for the grace today of getting to experience Saint Damian in a new way. May our lives be blessed by it, and may we come to share his spirit with others Lord, we also pray for the intercession of, what's the other saint? Soon to be saint.
Dutton?
Joseph Dutton.
St. John of Avila.
Okay.
We ask this all through Our Lady's intercession, and bless everyone who came here tonight and their families. Amen.
Amen. See you all soon, I hope, and thank you for the gift of your time and attention. We really love being part of this community with you. Good night.